Hi, I'm Dave Banker, and this is the Habanero Shakespeare Challenge. Now, the Habanero Shakespeare Challenge is when somebody, a willing participant, that's me, eats a raw habanero and then reads Shakespeare. But I'm going to do a twist on it. I'm going to read Shakespeare as Andy Griffith after having eaten habaneros.
All right. Oh my God. I can't even eat jalapenos with that.
Now, the play that I want to tell you about is Romeo and Juliet. Now there is a real thing. It's a story about a boy and a girl who is in love with one another, don't you see? It is. And everything would have been all right for them, except that their daddies didn't get along. They didn't. And when the play opens, Juliet's daddy is throwing this big fancy dress ball, and he invited the whole town to be there. But he didn't invite none of Romeo's people to come. And his buddies learned of it. And they put him up for slipping on a costume and slipping into this party. And Romeo was a spunky kind of boy, and he done it. Yes, sir, he done it, and when he got in there, everything was going good. Until all of a sudden, this girl Juliet come down the stairs. And he was so struck by her, he gave a soliloquy. Right there. He did. Now, a soliloquy is when a fellow looks way off into the distance and kind of talks to himself for a spell. If you do that today, they'll put you away. Anyhow, this particular soliloquy wasn't about being or not being. It was about doing or not doing. Well, the do's, they went out over the don'ts. And so what Romeo done, he got about a hand, and he started to take her out into the yard. And sadly, we'll never know what it was they was going to do out there, because this fellow Tybalt, he recognized Romeo for who he was. And he come up on him trying to pick a fight. But Juliet's daddy, he didn't want no bloodshed right there in the living room. So all he done was he run Romeo off. But Romeo didn't go straight, huh? No, he didn't. He went out and hid in the yard until everybody left the party. And when they'd all went, he popped up and looked around. And he seen this light come on way out yonder. And he says to himself, he says, hark. They said hark a whole lot back then. He says, hark. What light beyond yonder window shines? He did. And now let me tell you, Juliet stepped out of her bedroom window, out onto this stoop, and then she gave us a soliloquy. She did, friends. And somewhere in it she says, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? And he popped up and said, I'm right here. Well, as it happened, there was this great big vine going up the wall to Juliet's bedroom, and so he come up. Yes, sir, he come right on up, and that's where they had that famous balcony scene. And they hadn't been there but just a few minutes before he asked her to marry him. And that shows he was an honorable boy about it all. And Juliet says, well, when? And he says, now. And that shows he wasn't up there for no standard court, and he wanted to get on with the thing, if you know what I mean. Now, back then, most folks who lived in castles had a preacher fella who lived right there in the castle with them. And the preacher who lived in Juliet's castle was a fellow by the name of Friar Lawrence. And so Romeo and Juliet, they went downstairs and woke him up and told him what they wanted to do. And he thought that was all right. So he married him right then and there. But then, don't you see, there was the question of where they was going to spend the night. Things being the way they was and all with their daddies. And Friar Lawrence, he told Romeo that he ought to go on home that night. And of course, Romeo, well, he didn't take too hot to that. He didn't. No, sir, he didn't, but he went on home anyway. And then after a spell, Romeo thought to himself he'd better lay low till things cooled off. And while he was gone, friends and neighbors, Juliet's mama took a great notion that she ought to be married. And then she was in a bind. She didn't want two husbands, because she figured Romeo would be able to take care of her by himself. And so she went back down to Friar Lawrence to see what she ought to do. And he mixed her up a drink, and she drunk it. And she fell out across the bed there, and everybody thought she was dead. And they had this big, pretty funeral for her. And they laid her out in this big, pretty tomb. And everybody was just a crying and a sobbing. And before Friar Lawrence could get word to Romeo that she wasn't really dead, some of the mean boys that lived in that town told him that she was dead. And he figured life didn't hold nothing for him. So he went out and got him this big can of poison to drink. And then he went over to this tomb where it was she was laid out. And he opened the door and he says, "Oh my love, oh my wife." And then he went and he drank the poison and he kissed her. Y'all, he kissed that girl flat on the mouth. And he says, "With this kiss, I die." And he fell out across from there. And he was a big boy for his age. He was. And an impact of him falling on her woke her up. And she woke up and didn't know what was going on. And she looked there and she seen Romeo laying dead. And then she figured life didn't hold nothing for her. And then she took his knife and she ran it into herself. And she expired. She did. And the moral of it is, if you've got a boy that courts a girl that you don't like, or the other way around, if you don't want the expense of a double funeral, the best thing for you to do is let him have a cheap wedding. Now I want to tell y'all about a play I went to see recently. It was a play that was written way long ago by a fellow named William Shakespeare. You know, he lived over there in the old country. And this play is called Hamlet. And it was named after this boy, Hamlet, that appeared in the play. And it was pretty good, except that they don't speak as good at English as we do. Now, let me see. Hamlet lived over there in this castle in a place called Denmark with his mama and his daddy. And his daddy was the king over this land. And also living with them there was a fellow named Claudius. Now Claudius was Hamlet's uncle on his daddy's side. And before the play even started, this fellow Claudius plotted and killed Hamlet's daddy so he might gain the throne. And then he married Hamlet's mama. And that made him Hamlet's stepdad. And now, please do try to remember all of that, because you will need it later on. Now, there was also a fellow by the name of Polonius who lived there too. He was kind of an advisor to the king. And then there was a fellow named Horatio. He was Hamlet's buddy. He lived there. And then there was this girl named Ophelia, who was a visitant. She was Hamlet's sweetheart. You know, he met her when he was in high school. And then there were all kinds of maids and soldiers and stable boys who lived there too. And now, like I said, remember, before the play even opens up, Hamlet's daddy was already dead. And when the play opens up, it opens up on these two soldiers that was just standing guard one night, and this ghost come up on them. And one of them says, "Hark." He says, "Hark, what is this thing I see before me?" And the other one says, "Let us flee and seek young Hamlet, for behold, it shares a visage like unto his father." And it did, looked just exactly like him. So they went into the house to find Hamlet, but he had just come in from high school and football practice, and he was tired and had gone on to bed. But anyhow, they woke him up and told him about it, and he got on up and put on his breeches and went on back doors with him. And when he got there, the ghost started talking to him. And the ghost says, "Behold, Hamlet, Look on me, for I am the ghost of your father. And then the ghost went on to tell him that it was Claudius what plotted against him and killed him. You know, like I told you a while ago? Well, after the ghost told him what he told him, it made Hamlet swear to seek out vengeance on his former uncle and present stepdaddy, Claudius. And then the ghost went off, and didn't nobody see him again after that. And it was right there that Hamlet gave that famous soliloquy about being or not being. And when he come close to the end of it, he come up on this young girl, Ophelia. You know, the one that he was kind of sweet on that I told you about a little while ago? He says to himself, soft, I see Ophelia fair. Well, he sat down and started talking to her. Asked her how she was, how her daddy was, how her mama was, how Sunday school was going. And while she was talking, he looked up and he seen a fella sneaking and hiding behind the cedar chest over yonder. He did. So he took out his sword and he run the fella. He run him upstairs, he run him downstairs. But he couldn't catch him and it made him mad. And so he come back to Ophelia, all mad at her for some reason. And Lord, he hit that girl in the face. Throw her down to the ground. And then he says, get thee to a nunnery, for thy face is a vile thing before my eyes. And now, y'all, it was right about here when Hamlet began acting like he wasn't all there. You see, he figured that if the people who plotted and killed his daddy thought if he wasn't right in the mind, they might feel more comfortable to talk around him, you know? But they didn't. Silly plan didn't work, and now poor Ophelia got a black eye. So anyhow, one evening, a little while later, he was up in his mama's room and telling her good night, and he looked over, and he saw the curtains are rustling just the least little bit. And he eased out his sword, and he edged over to where the curtains was a rustling, and he see there was a fellow hiding behind him, and he run the fellow through. And that fellow fell down dead. And he seen was that fellow Polonius there that I told you about a little while ago. Well, what Hamlet done, he picked him up and took him over and throwed him out this little window here into this creek that run by, and none of them ever missed him after that. And then a few days later, this carnival come through town. Sideshows and show folks, you know. So Hamlet had them over to the house to put on a show, exactly the way the murder of the king was committed. And let me tell you, when they got to the place in the play where the king was killed, Hamlet's stepdaddy got on up out of his chair and he said, "Hold." He says, "Cease this wild carrying on and evil acting in the palace of the king." And he run him out of the house. And it was right there that Hamlet knew he was going to have to even once and for all with his stepdaddy for killing his actual daddy. And it was also right there that Hamlet's stepdaddy knew he'd have to get shut of that boy or he'd have some awful serious trouble on his hands. Well, what Claudius, the impostor king, done the next day was he put on a big sword fight between Hamlet and this other fella. And he give this other fella a sword with a poison point on it, because he wasn't into fighting fair, you know? And he give Hamlet a plain sword. And he had a bowl full of poison wine for Hamlet to drink just in case he won the sword fight. Well, the king puts up his hands and he says, "Y'all lay on now." They went to it. Hamlet backed the fella backed Hamlet, and they went back and forth like that, and pretty soon Hamlet got a cut on his arm by that poisoned sword. He commenced to weaken, but he fought harder than ever. He kept on backing that fella and backing that fella and backing it off till he run him through. That's right. And the fella fell dead. Then Hamlet went over to take a drink of that poison wine, and his mama, she knew it was poison, so she ran over and took it and drunk it herself, and she fell dead. And Hamlet, with his last breath, went up to his stepdaddy, run him through.